The jungle did not care who ruled the Pacific. It swallowed men the same way it swallowed light, without mercy, without pause. Beneath the dense canopy, the air hung thick as soup, filled with the hum of insects and the stink of decay. Vines wrapped around rifles, mud pulled at boots, and every step felt like wading through a fever dream. In this place, even the trees seemed alive, watching, waiting. The Americans called it the Green Hell. The Japanese called it home. When American forces first met the Imperial Japanese Army in the jungles of the Southwest Pacific, they discovered a kind of warfare no textbook had ever prepared them for. At Guadalcanal, on the Kokada Track, and along the coasts of New Guinea, the soldiers of an industrial power found themselves fighting an enemy who could vanish between breaths. The Japanese infantrymen, raised on the bush tactics of China and trained to move silently through terrain most Western armies avoided, seemed supernatural. They came without warning, their bayonets flashing from the foliage, their voices rising in chilling cries of "Banzai!" And then they were gone. In those early months of 1942 and 1943, American patrols died without ever seeing who killed them. The first to face this nightmare were the Australians. When Japan invaded Papua New Guinea, Australian militia units and regulars fought along the Kokada Track, a narrow, mud-choked trail winding through mountain jungle so dense that radio signals died in the canopy. The Japanese troops, stripped to their waists, advanced with eerie precision, carrying mortars on bamboo poles and rifles wrapped in oilcloth to keep them dry. They seemed tireless. Australian survivors would later describe them as ghosts with rifles. Then came the Americans, young, untested, and unprepared for what they were walking into. The U.S. Army's 32nd Division arrived in New Guinea in mid-1942, equipped for a conventional war, heavy packs, wool uniforms, and artillery pieces that sunk into the mud. The men thought they were going to fight soldiers. Instead, they fought the jungle. The heat was suffocating, sweat never dried, food spoiled within hours. Flies swarmed over every wound. You could hear them before you saw them, one private recalled of the Japanese. A whisper in the grass, a footstep that wasn't yours, and then someone was gone. At night, the jungle came alive with sound, frogs, insects, and the rustle of unseen movement. The Americans fired blindly into the darkness, wasting ammunition on ghosts. In the morning, they found nothing but footprints and spent shells. To the Japanese, this was how war was meant to be fought. For years, their officers had trained to use stealth, endurance, and the environment as weapons. In their doctrine, the jungle was not an obstacle. It was a shield, a weapon, a home. Every soldier was taught to move silently, to blend into the earth, to survive on rice and rainwater for days without resupply. Their officers carried bamboo whistles to signal attacks. Their scouts marked trails with cuts invisible to Western eyes. A Japanese platoon could crawl within 30 yards of an American position without being detected. When they attacked, it was sudden and total. Bursts of fire from nowhere, bayonets flashing in the rain. To the Americans, it was terror. To the Japanese, it was discipline. The American command, trained in European-style warfare, struggled to understand. Maps were useless. Roads turned to rivers overnight. Artillery could not be aimed through the canopy, and aircraft saw nothing but green. Units became lost and isolated. Orders meant nothing when your compass pointed east but the river ran west. In the first weeks at Buna and Gona in late 1942, entire platoons vanished. The men who survived described an enemy they never saw, only heard. The click of a bolt, the hiss of a whisper, the single flash of a muzzle before the jungle closed again. But if the jungle favored the Japanese, it punished everyone. Both armies found themselves fighting hunger, disease, and exhaustion more than each other. Mosquitoes carried malaria, leeches slid into boots and helmets, men's skin rotted under their clothes from constant moisture. We smelled like the dead, and sometimes we couldn't tell the difference, one Marine wrote. By December 1942, American forces at Guadalcanal were barely holding on. The Japanese attacked nightly. Mortar fire, sniper shots, infiltration raids, while rain turned every trench into a swamp. The Marines slept sitting up to keep their faces above water. Yet they refused to break. "We weren't fighting men, we were fighting ghosts that would not die," a Japanese officer wrote later. Even so, the Americans knew they were outmatched in the jungle. They had firepower, but no finesse. They could bombard the trees for hours and still not kill the men hiding inside them. Patrols sent to clear ridges often returned half their size, or didn't return at all. The frustration was endless. You couldn't shoot the jungle, but the jungle could sure as hell shoot you. The turning point came not in a single battle, but in a realization. American commanders began to understand that they were not just losing to Japan, they were losing to the land itself. And if they were going to survive, they would have to become something different, something that could move, see, and strike as the Japanese did. In early 1943, units began improvising. Men ditched heavy packs and marched light. They learned to fight without shoes, to read the direction of broken leaves, to crawl instead of walk. Medics studied native remedies for infection. Officers sketched new maps based on the trails of animals and rivers instead of roads. The transformation had begun, slow, brutal, and born of desperation. By the end of that year, the jungle would no longer belong to Japan alone. But for now, in 1942, the green hell still whispered in Japanese voices. The Americans were strangers in a world of vines and shadows, trying to fight ghosts they could not see. They would learn, but they would pay for every lesson in blood. By the spring of 1943, the Americans had stopped calling the jungle an enemy. They had begun to call it a teacher, a cruel, unrelenting teacher whose lessons were written in blood and fever. Every soldier who survived Guadalcanal, Buna, or Munda carried those lessons carved into his bones. Silence saves lives, fire attracts death, and in the jungle, nothing belongs to you. Not your comfort, not your strength, not even the air you breathe. After 6 months of misery and mistakes, the U.S. Army and Marine Corps began to change. Commanders stopped pretending the Pacific was like Europe. They stopped talking about front lines and started talking about trails. The jungle, they realized, was not a battlefield. It was a maze, and whoever learned to move through that maze unseen would win. It began in the training camps, far from the front lines, under the same blazing sun and choking humidity. On Oahu, in Hawaii, the Army opened its first jungle training center in early 1943. Soldiers who had never seen a palm tree were suddenly ordered to sleep under them, to wade through rivers waist-deep in mud, to eat rations that turned sour in hours. Instructors, veterans of the Solomons and New Guinea, drilled recruits in a new way of thinking. "You can't fight what you can't find," one sergeant barked, "so learn to find first, shoot later." They learned to move in single file, each man a shadow behind the other. They learned to wrap their rifles in cloth to muffle noise, to step only on roots and rocks to avoid leaving tracks, to smell smoke in the wind long before they saw it. The jungle punished arrogance and rewarded patience. Meanwhile, in the steaming swamps of New Guinea, American and Australian units were learning the same lessons the hard way. The combined Allied offensive at Buna and Sanananda in early 1943 had shown just how suicidal conventional tactics were. The Japanese bunkers, hidden beneath palm fronds and camouflaged with living vines, could survive artillery bombardments and reopen within minutes. Machine guns were placed in overlapping fields of fire, invisible until they spoke. Soldiers who charged them head-on never returned. So the Americans stopped charging. Instead, they began to crawl. Small fire teams, often led by men who had learned from the Australians, started to flank Japanese positions, creeping through swamps, cutting paths with machetes, inching forward under cover of the rain. They used grenades and flamethrowers to clear bunkers, not bayonets. The new motto, whispered among the troops, was simple: don't fight the jungle, use it. For the first time, American units began to disappear into the foliage, just as the Japanese did.
and the Japanese noticed. One diary found on a fallen officer near Buma read, "The enemy comes like we do now. We see only movement, then fire. They have learned too fast." Behind these transformations stood experience and loss. The Marine raiders, who had suffered horribly in the early Solomon's campaigns, were the first to turn those experiences into doctrine. On islands like New Georgia and Vela Lavella, they perfected hit-and-run tactics, striking Japanese patrols at dawn and vanishing into the mist before reinforcements arrived. Raiders traveled light, carrying only what they could eat and shoot. They painted their faces, wrapped their boots in burlap to muffle steps, and used bird calls to signal movement. The Japanese, who once mocked Americans as loud and clumsy, began to fear the unseen. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commander of the 1st Marine Division, issued new guidance for jungle warfare. Quote, "Move like water. Never make the same noise twice. If the enemy cannot see you, he cannot kill you." End quote. The Marines took it to heart. By mid-1943, the jungle war had become an education in adaptation. Soldiers learned to read trails the way a hunter reads the ground. Broken twigs meant recent passage. Bent brass meant movement within the hour. A sudden silence in the insects often meant an ambush ahead. Men could sense the enemy without seeing him, their instincts sharpened by terror and repetition. Technology began to follow. Radios were redesigned to resist humidity. Sea rations were modified to last longer in the heat. Mosquito nets, once ignored, became as essential as bullets. Medics discovered quinine and atabrine were worth more than ammunition, for malaria killed more men than the Japanese ever could. Even weapons evolved. The long, heavy M1 Garand was awkward in the vines, so many soldiers switched to the lighter Thompson submachine gun, perfect for close-range bursts in thick brush. Shotguns, dismissed in Europe as, quote, trench relics, became jungle kings. A single blast from 10 yards could cut through vines, foliage, and flesh alike. And in the Pacific, word began to spread among Japanese patrols. The enemy was changing. In the summer of 1943, at Munda Point in the Central Solomons, that change became undeniable. American troops advancing through mangrove swamps moved in silence, coordinating hand signals instead of shouting. When Japanese troops ambushed them, the Americans didn't panic. They countered with flanking fire and creeping mortar teams. Within an hour, the ambushers were surrounded. When it was over, a captured Japanese officer told his interrogators, "We thought you were still clumsy Americans, but you fight like junglemen now." Those words spread through the ranks like fire. It wasn't just victory, it was evolution. But evolution came at a cost. The jungle demanded everything. Many of the men who learned its secrets would not live long enough to use them again. Patrols that vanished into the mist were often never seen again, their trails marked only by rusting helmets and broken rifles. "We were becoming ghosts," a Marine raider said later. But ghosts can die too. Still, the transformation could not be stopped. The Americans were learning what the Japanese once knew, that survival in the jungle was not about strength or numbers, but silence, cunning, and endurance. The Pacific War was no longer fought only with ships and planes. It was fought with footsteps, whispers, and shadows beneath the leaves. By the end of 1943, the Japanese advantage was fading. Their patrols no longer moved unseen. Their ambushes no longer surprised. And for the first time, they began to fear the soundless approach of men who had once been strangers to the jungle, men who now belonged to it. The teacher had done its work. The green hell had created something new, something the Japanese had not expected and would soon come to dread. The Americans had learned to fight like ghosts.
The rain never stopped. It came in curtains that blurred the horizon, in torrents that drowned sound and light alike. The jungle of Bougainville was a labyrinth of vines, rivers, and roots, a place where visibility ended at 10 feet, and every sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. For the first time since the war began, That uncertainty no longer favored the Japanese. By late 1943, the Jungle War had changed hands. The Americans, once clumsy and loud in the undergrowth, now moved with the same cold discipline that had defined their enemy a year before. Patrols left Henderson Field and Cape Torokina at dawn and vanished into the trees without a word. They painted their helmets with streaks of mud, tied strips of cloth around their rifles to dampen sound, and carried only what could fit in their pockets and packs. When they moved, the jungle itself seemed to swallow them whole. And when they struck, it was sudden, merciless, and precise. On the morning of November 8, 1943, a patrol from the 3rd Marine Division crept along a ridge near Piva Village, Bougainville. The mist was thick enough to hide a man at arm's length. Ahead, a Japanese column was advancing, 20 men, rifles at the ready, moving single file along a narrow trail. They had been hunting Americans for days. But the Americans had already found them. At a whispered signal, 2 bar gunners opened fire from the flank. The Japanese froze as bullets tore through the trees. Within seconds, grenades rained down from above, and the jungle exploded with flame. The survivors tried to retreat, only to find the escape route already blocked. When the firing stopped, silence fell again. Not one Marine had been hit. "Like ghosts," a captured Japanese soldier muttered later. "They came like ghosts." Across the Pacific, similar stories spread. In the Arakan jungles of Burma, the British Chindits, long-range penetration units trained by Brigadier Ord Wingate, were perfecting the same craft. Operating hundreds of miles behind enemy lines, they lived off the land, slept in hammocks above the mud, and fought in ambushes measured in seconds. To the Japanese, who had once claimed mastery of the jungle, these new enemies were uncanny. Chindit columns appeared out of nowhere, cut supply lines, and vanished into the mist before reinforcements arrived. Meanwhile, in the Central Pacific, the American Marine raiders and Army infantry in the Solomons had turned stealth into routine. They fought in 3-man fire teams, 1 rifle, 1 bar, 1 grenadier. Each man trained to operate independently if the others fell. They no longer feared the night, they used it. At Munda, New Georgia, and Kolombangara, Japanese patrols began to report something new: American troops moving without sound, attacking from unexpected angles, and retreating before counterfire. The Japanese word yurei, ghost, appeared repeatedly in captured diaries. One entry from late 1943 read, "The enemy is no longer afraid of the jungle. They move in it as we do. They strike and vanish. Even the trees seem to fight for them." The transformation was not just physical, it was psychological. American troops had learned to think like hunters. Where once they feared the unseen, now they embraced it. "If you can't see them," one sergeant told his men, "make sure they can't see you either." Every branch, every patch of mist became an ally. Recon teams learned to use the jungle sounds to mask their movements, marching only when the rain fell, freezing when the wind stopped. At night, the new masters of stealth became predators. Small units slipped into Japanese camps, planted satchel charges or grenades, and slipped away before dawn. When the explosions came, the Japanese fired blindly into the trees, hitting nothing. "We could feel their panic," a Marine raider remembered. "That's when we knew the tables had turned." The proof came at Bougainville in December 1943. General Hiyatake, determined to drive the Americans from their beachhead, launched a counterattack through the jungle. He believed his men still held the advantage in terrain and stealth. But what awaited them was not the untrained foe of Guadalcanal. The Americans had prepared layered defenses that blended seamlessly into the jungle. Foxholes dug into roots, machine guns camouflaged with palm leaves, artillery zeroed in on every trail. When the Japanese assault began under cover of darkness, they found themselves walking into a trap they could not see. The Marines held their fire until the enemy was within 50 yards. Then, from the darkness, The night erupted. Tracers streaked through the trees, grenades burst from invisible hands, and mortars dropped their shells through the canopy like thunder. Within an hour, the Japanese line was shattered. When the sun rose, hundreds of bodies lay tangled in the vines. The Americans had lost fewer than 100 men. They were not soldiers, one Japanese officer wrote afterwards. They were spirits with guns. The same transformation was unfolding elsewhere. In New Guinea, the U.S. 32nd Division, the same men who had once stumbled and died in the swamps of Buna, fought through the Huon Peninsula with brutal efficiency. They infiltrated Japanese strongpoints at night, using machetes to clear silent paths, marking their positions with strips of white cloth to guide artillery. American engineers, once helpless in the mud, now built makeshift bridges from palm trunks and vines, advancing faster than the Japanese could retreat. Australian units, veterans of Kokoda, watched with astonishment. They've learned. By God, they've learned. The jungle, which had once been Japan's shield, now hid their enemies instead. For the Japanese soldiers trapped in this new reality, the fear was unlike anything they had felt before. They were trained to fight loud, to charge, to overwhelm, but now they were being hunted by an enemy who no longer played by those rules. American patrols seemed to materialize out of the mist, strike and vanish. The old confidence, the belief that the jungle belonged to Japan, began to crumble. One diary recovered from Bougainville told the story in 12 simple words. The enemy has taken the jungle. We have nowhere left to hide. By the end of 1943, the myth of Japanese invincibility in the Pacific was dead. The Americans, the Australians, the British, they had all learned to move, fight, and kill in the jungle's shadow. The terrain that had once destroyed them had become their greatest weapon. The ghosts had changed sides. And soon those ghosts would lead the march back across the Pacific, from the Solomons to the Philippines, from the swamps of New Guinea to the cliffs of Okinawa, silent, unseen, unstoppable. The hunters had become the haunted. By 1944, the jungle no longer whispered in Japanese, it spoke in English. The empire that had once prided itself on vanishing into the green now found itself surrounded by it, trapped and suffocating in its own former kingdom. The hunters had become the hunted, and the jungle, the one ally that had shielded Japan's advance, had turned against them. The shift was not sudden. It came in footsteps, in whispers, in the methodical rhythm of American patrols that no longer feared what lay beyond the vines. What began as survival in 1942 had evolved by 1944 into precision warfare. The Americans had learned to use every leaf, every sound, every breath of the forest as a weapon. The Japanese, who once ruled the shadows, now found themselves stalked by them. On Biak Island in the spring of 1944, the lesson came with fire and thunder. Japanese defenders had spent months fortifying the island's interior caves, hundreds of limestone bunkers, carved into cliffs, connected by tunnels and hidden firing slits. They believed the Americans, soft and mechanical, could never root them out. They were wrong. When the U.S. 41st Infantry Division landed on Biak, they did not charge headlong into ambushes. They advanced slowly, invisibly like predators. Scouts marked trails with twine and bamboo. Radio men whispered coordinates through sets wrapped in cloth to muffle noise. At night, spotter planes circled silently above the clouds, their radar and signal lamps mapping enemy movement. Then came the artillery, guided by eyes the Japanese never saw. Shells fell with uncanny precision, turning entire cave mouths into glowing craters. When the bombardment ended, flamethrower teams moved forward, their nozzles breathing liquid fire into the tunnels. It was the smell of hell, one Japanese survivor recalled. The earth itself burned. When the battle ended, hundreds of Japanese soldiers lay dead in the same caves they had sworn were impenetrable. The Americans had not just conquered the island, they had mastered the terrain that was supposed to protect it. In the Philippines, the pattern repeated. By late 1944, General Douglas MacArthur had returned as promised. His troops, many of them veterans of the Solomons and New Guinea, now fought like phantoms in the rainforests of Leyte and Luzon. The U.S. Army's 6th Ranger Battalion led the way, small, stealthy, and relentless. They cut Japanese supply lines in the dark, ambushed convoys, and guided artillery fire with uncanny accuracy. Japanese columns moving through the jungles at night began to whisper about shadow men who struck without warning. Sentries would be missing, their throats cut, their rifles gone. Sometimes they found nothing at all, just footprints in the mud leading nowhere. One captured diary told the story bluntly. "We no longer control the jungle. The enemy moves through it as if born here. Their rifles have eyes, their planes see in darkness. We are dying in silence." It was not superstition, it was science. The Americans had turned stealth into a system. Aerial reconnaissance fed directly into field radios. Patrols were tracked by air and supplied by parachute. Radar posts on destroyers offshore could detect Japanese movements long before they reached the beaches. Technology had replaced mysticism. Planning had replaced faith. For the Japanese, the old creed of willpower and endurance meant nothing when the enemy could see them through clouds. In Burma, the transformation was even more striking. British and American forces, supported by Chinese divisions and the famed Merrill's Marauders, moved through jungles once thought impassable. Carrying everything on their backs or by pack mule, they cut through vines and rain like blades through smoke. Each man carried days' worth of supplies, radio batteries wrapped in wax, and machetes worn down to the hilt. Japanese garrisons along the Irrawaddy River were caught off guard again and again by forces they thought were hundreds of miles away. When the Marauders struck Midikina Airfield in May 1944, they did so after 3 months of marching through disease, monsoon, and exhaustion, appearing out of the jungle like an army of ghosts. Japanese officers couldn't believe what they were seeing. These were not the soft, careless Americans they remembered from 1942. These were hunters who could starve, march, and kill in silence. One Japanese prisoner, sick with malaria and disbelief, told his captors, "You fight like us, but you have endless men, endless guns. The jungle was supposed to be ours. Now it belongs to you." The mastery of jungle warfare went beyond tactics. It was psychological. For years, Japanese soldiers had been told that their spiritual strength made them invincible in nature. That belief had carried them from China to Malaya to New Guinea. But by 1944, the illusion cracked. They saw American troops, white, black, brown, marching through the same swamps, enduring the same leeches and fever, eating the same rotten rice, and still advancing. The realization was devastating. The jungle, once Japan's great equalizer, no longer protected them. The Empire's soldiers, cut off from supplies and starving in their own strongholds, began to die not from combat, but from despair. "We are surrounded by ghosts," one Japanese corporal wrote before his death. "They come with the night and the rain. They never stop coming." Nowhere was this reversal more complete than at Peleliu. There, the Japanese built the most elaborate defensive system of the Pacific, honeycombs of coral caves and tunnels reinforced with steel and concrete. They prepared to bleed the Americans white in the heat and rock. Yet even here, the U.S. Marines and Army adapted. Instead of charging bunkers head-on, they isolated and starved them. Engineers used demolition charges to seal tunnels. Flamethrower teams burned out air from chambers, forcing defenders to suffocate or surrender. Each Japanese position that fell became a tomb. Each new one was approached with silence, patience, and fire. The Americans, a captured Japanese officer said afterwards, fight as if they have no blood to lose. By the end of the battle, the Japanese had killed thousands but lost everything. Their old advantage, terrain, was gone. The jungle, the caves, the rocks, all had become prisons. In the span of 2 years, the Pacific War had turned inside out. The Americans who once stumbled through swamps now mapped them like cities. The Japanese who once struck like tigers now waited for death in their own lairs. The jungle had chosen its new master, not through divine favor, but through adaptation, reason, and sheer endurance. By the close of 1944, every battle told the same story. The empire that had claimed nature's favor was now being consumed by it. The Americans, the Australians, the British, and their allies had learned too much, too fast. The jungle, once Japan's fortress, had become its grave, and the ghosts who now walked its paths no longer spoke of survival, they spoke of victory. By 1945, the jungle was silent again, but not with peace. The silence was the sound of defeat. The rustle of leaves and the hum of insects hid not ambushes now, but graves. The Japanese Empire, which had once moved through Asia with the stealth of a panther, was bleeding out in the very terrain it had once mastered. The jungle, its oldest ally, had turned indifferent. In the Philippines, the remnants of Japan's once proud divisions clung to the mountains, starving and diseased. Their uniforms were rags, their rifles rusted. They had no food, no medicine, and no command left to follow. They hid in the same caves they had built to fight from, waiting for the next American patrol that would find them, or for hunger to finish what bullets had started. The Americans had become phantoms in the green. Patrols advanced through the misted valleys of Luzon and Leyte with machine pistols and machetes, whispering to one another in low tones, marking trails with chalk symbols no enemy could understand. They hunted by smell, by instinct, by silence. They could tell the difference between the scent of rain and the scent of men nearby. The jungle, which had once belonged to Japan, now moved for them. One captured Japanese lieutenant said simply, "They do not fight as men. They come from nowhere. They are already here before we see them." At night, American and Filipino guerrillas struck with ghostly precision. They moved through the bamboo, using captured Japanese rifles to confuse sentries. Ammunition dumps vanished in flames. Entire outposts were erased without a shot fired. "The enemy walks like a leaf in the wind," one diary said. "He is there, then gone. The jungle hides him from our eyes." But the truth was that nothing hid the Japanese anymore, not even the jungle. American spotter planes now circled overhead, their radar scanning the canopy, detecting movement invisible to the human eye. The new compact radios connected patrols miles apart. Fire missions could be called in from any ridge, any clearing. Within minutes, artillery shells rained down from positions the Japanese didn't even know existed. Technology had finished what experience began. The empire that once believed its courage would overcome any machine now found itself destroyed by machines that could fight without ever seeing their enemy. In Burma, it was the same story. The Japanese 15th Army, once considered the finest jungle force in the world, was collapsing under pressure from British, Indian, Chinese, and American troops. The Allied advance on Mandalay and Meiktila in 1945 cut through the forest with a coordination the Japanese could not believe possible. Merrill's Marauders had evolved into the Mars Task Force, using air supply, radar-guided artillery, and pinpoint intelligence to outmaneuver enemy divisions that had no idea they were surrounded until it was too late. The Japanese tried to counterattack, but their lines of communication were gone. Rivers that once hid them now guided Allied landing craft. Trails once patrolled by Imperial scouts now led directly to their graves. In the Irrawaddy Valley, a Japanese officer wrote in his journal before burning it, "We fought the British in the jungle and won. We fought the Chinese and endured. But these new Americans, they move like ghosts, but they bring thunder." By mid-1945, the ghosts had a name: victory. Everywhere, Japanese garrisons were isolated. On Borneo, in Malaya, on Luzon, in Burma. The soldiers who had learned to survive on roots and silence now faced an enemy that could live off the sky itself, supplied by endless airdrops and guided by invisible intelligence. Their stealth, once unmatched, meant nothing against radar and reconnaissance. Their courage, once feared, now seemed futile against the impersonal efficiency of an industrial war machine that never slept. Those few who survived long enough to surrender often wept, not from shame, but from confusion. One Japanese sergeant captured near Baguio told his interrogators, "You became what we were, and you were stronger than us." He wasn't wrong. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the jungle held more secrets than any nation could count. American patrols still moved through the trees for weeks afterward, searching for Japanese holdouts who refused to believe the emperor's surrender. Many of them never came out. Some fought for years, unable to accept that the world they had known was gone. But for those who did surrender, the sight that awaited them was as disorienting as it was devastating. The Americans they had once mocked as soft, noisy, and careless were now masters of stealth and survival. They carried themselves like the very soldiers Japan had once trained to be: quiet, relentless, and impossible to kill. At one surrender site on Mindanao, a Japanese officer reportedly said to his captor, "You have become the true soldiers of the jungle. We are the ones who do not belong here anymore." In the aftermath, military historians would call it the reversal of mastery. What began as Japan's greatest advantage, its experience in bush warfare, its patience, its discipline, had become the very weapon that destroyed it. The Americans had absorbed everything the Japanese knew and combined it with something Japan could not replicate: limitless resources, industrial strength, and the ability to adapt faster than the enemy could die. The transformation had been total. From the terrified Marines at Guadalcanal to the seasoned veterans of Luzon, the evolution was complete. They had entered the war stumbling through vines and fever, and they ended it as ghosts in the jungle, men who could move unseen, strike without hesitation, and live off nothing but rain, mud, and willpower. The Japanese, for all their valor, never recovered from that reversal. Even nature seemed to remember. When the guns fell silent, the jungle began to reclaim everything: the rusted helmets, the broken rifles, the graves unmarked by flags. The vines crept over bunkers, and the trees swallowed the paths that had once led to death. But deep beneath the canopy, the echo of footsteps remained: the ghosts of men from both sides who had fought, bled, and vanished into the green. The Americans had come as strangers. They left as masters. And for those who had seen it, one truth endured: in the jungle, no nation ruled forever. But for a brief, terrible time, the Americans walked there like ghosts, and the empire that once taught them to fear the dark learned too late that ghosts do not fear the jungle.